All money is ultimately a matter of faith. Adam Smith said that in Wealth of Nations in 1776, and it's absolutely true. The question is, what do you have faith in? When we talk about US dollars or British pounds or anything, we're talking about a currency, a system of exchange that is based on the idea that it's going to maintain its value, that for some reason, those people who have issued it aren't going to screw up in some way. An argument in favor of a gold standard is basically that there is a limit to what they can do, that it all comes out against some kind of reserves of some kind of tangible asset: gold, glass beads, very large stones. It could be anything, really. It could be coffee, but something that's limited. This is really important to our understanding of money, at least psychologically. Modern monetary theory is a new way of looking at things that gets us away from what we would call the market based analysis of money, the money supply argument. Now, long, long ago, I could give you some links to it, but I did a brief, more than that brief, video on what is money. And I stand by that in terms of what money is or was going into this pandemic cycle. Because money is not really created by the federal government as much as it is by banks. All money is debt as we know it. Now, I did leave out something very important, and that is the debt caused by a tax liability. Okay, the government says you owe us so much and you have to pay us. What do you pay us in? Well, you pay us in the currency that the government issues. The thing that most people need to understand is that when we talk about the government borrowing money and then spending it, it's kind of reverse. Actually, the government just spends it and then figures out how to cover that later on. We're seeing this today. We live in a world of modern monetary theory where the spending is going out to help kickstart the economy through the coronavirus, and we're going to figure out how it comes out later. Really? Is that what's going on? Well, actually, we do have a way of financing it. In the United States, we can issue bonds for upwards of many trillions of dollars. Who's going to buy those? Well, the Federal Reserve can buy some of them. What is the Federal Reserve? Well, they're the ones who theoretically issue the currency, therefore, they can issue more of the currency and buy the US bonds. So then the US government pays interest to the Federal Reserve, and all of the profits from the Federal Reserve go back to the US government at the end of the year. It's kind of a hot patch to the system that is based on debt. So maybe we've found a way to get past debt based money, as I discussed earlier. Well, modern monetary theory tells us that we really need to take a step back and look at everything. Now, I've been very, very slow to get into this because I want to make sure I represent it properly. I know most people are not. What it comes down to is Warren Mosler back in 1980s observed this simple phenomenon that governments actually spend and then tax, or spend and then borrow. It goes in that order, and that this is extremely important to understanding how everything operates. I'm going to give a link to his 1993 paper, which is entitled Soft Currency Economics, which is based on this idea that everything is fluid. Now, do we have to have an underlying debt in order to have a currency? The answer is no. But the underlying debt, as we know it, allows banks through the entire system to essentially create money, to expand the money supply and away from the government for the purpose of private enterprise. It does this by putting limits on what can be done so that we don't have a tremendous expansion that goes all crazy. What limits would there be on a government from spending money? This is where we start saying, modern monetary is nothing but Venezuela, Zimbabwe, you name it, Weimar Germany, you name any country that's had a runaway inflation problem, And that's what we can talk about. Indeed, what are the limits? Currently, we have limits that are described by the market, but we just figured out the hot patch to get around that. So we don't really have the limits that we traditionally think of. Furthermore, it should be obvious that the Friedmanite view that it's all about the money supply at least has its limits. I would argue that it's failing dramatically, and we're going to see how that goes. So the answer would be instead what? Keynesianism, as I discussed earlier, where all money comes from the government, that tax liability, that full faith and credit of the United States government. I mean, what do you have faith in to call it money? So, where do we go from here? Understanding MMT starts with the basic idea that we need to look at where money comes from and where it goes and how it circulates. Now, think of a bank. Imagine a bank for a moment. If you imagine sort of a Roman temple, as it were, congratulations. That's the image they want you to have. Sort of like the federal government, right? The great columns and all that stuff. This is actually a very ancient thing. In the Roman Empire, the treasury was the temple of Jupiter. The biggest god of all was where they kept their money. It's kind of interesting. Um, that sense of permanence, that it's all fixed, that we are secure, is something that they want you to have because that's something you can have faith in. In reality, a bank is a machine. It might be much better to think of an old-fashioned steam engine going back and forth, because that is how it operates. Everything is done dynamically in this world. The value of something is not known until it is spent. I mean, for example, you might have a share of stock worth $100. The market says it's worth $100. Oh, tomorrow it's worth $102. I just gained $2. No, you didn't. You have something that is theoretically worth $102. Now, if everybody decided to sell that stock at once, what would it be worth? Pretty close to zero. We have seen that. So what is it actually worth? Sitting there right now, you can claim some number based on where other things like it are trading, if it is not completely unique. But what is it actually worth today, liquid for you? Everything is defined dynamically. And this is one of the key principles of modern monetary theory. It's all about the spending first, that the borrowing part and the market mechanisms are just ways of regulating how far we go. So the question becomes, under modern monetary theory, at least how we're operating today, I mean, what really are the limits? What prevents us from just printing more currency to the point where it keeps going? Well, it's a cycle. You have to keep printing more money. If at any time you turn off the printing press, the whole process stops. The problem comes that you don't turn off the press because you always need more money. That's the issue at hand. So, I want to get into modern monetary theory, but I first wanted to lay out the original paper by Warren Mosler, 1993, a recent interview with him, and also what I said before about what is money, or at least what money was before we came into this crisis and where we're going with it. Because this is what I want to talk about. In a truly dynamic world, and money is more and more dynamic all the time, how do we define it? I mean, right now there are $20 trillion roughly out there in US dollars. What if there was only one? I mean, what if it turned over all the time and that was what everybody had to define themselves? Well, in order to get to 20 trillion, the 330 Americans, if you had just $1, we would have to turn it over, 60,000 times in a year? The current velocity of money is about 1. So we're off by 4.8 orders of magnitude. That's the issue. The actual count of how much money is there is not as important as how rapidly it turns over, how dynamic the economy is. What we have seen is that our economy has become less and less dynamic with time. There's more money out there, and it's just not turning over. We've gone from a velocity of turning over 2.4 times ish per year, down below 1. All right? That's the issue at hand. The less dynamic it is, the less that machine keeps operating, that we would call a bank, the lower the actual value of them, or the lower the value of the total economy. And at some point, we start breaking the fundamental social contract. You work for a living and you get by. That's basically what it comes down to. So I'm going to start discussing modern monetary theory, but I wanted to start with this simple observation. Modern monetary theory starts with monetary operations as they really have existed all the way through since the 1970s, certainly. The money is spent, and then the money comes back. Now, we're seeing this explode in the process of trying to keep the economy operating through the coronavirus case. But what are the limits? How dynamic is the whole process? In fact, who is getting the money and why? These are the sorts of issues that we need to discuss in order to think about modern monetary theory. But first, it starts with modern monetary operations. Money, as we know it, is really just printed. What do we do about it? Thanks.